Hey, what's going on, guys? KitsuneTCG here, back with another video, and today I thought I would focus on some budget-friendly decks that you can kind of pick up, and depending on the deck that you kind of go with, see some competitive success, or if you're just kind of going for a more casual level deck, just kind of some different options that you have available to you as well. Now, I just kind of, when I was looking at this, to find everything by, about $100 baseline for the deck core itself. For some of these, if you add in staples, it does take it a little bit over that, but I really think staples are kind of on just a different playing field. When it comes to playing Yu-Gi-Oh, I definitely recommend picking those up separately and just making sure that, you always have access to a playset of like Ash Blossom, Imperm. Those just slot into almost pretty much every one of these decks we're showcasing here, so really I just think those are something kind of separate to just kind of always keep an eye on. And if you're going to play competitively to maybe even like semi-casually, just having access to some of those is pretty important. So didn't definitely kind of take those into like price consideration, but that is, I definitely think, something else to consider. And some point in the near future, I'll definitely do a kind of tier list on which ones to pick up. I would recommend first. So kind of starting off here, we do have a pure Ice Barrier deck. Obviously with the new Battles of Legend, Ice Barrier did get a nice buff. Now, kind of where it will finish out, I think really just depends on, how things, kind of pan out. If we get a ban list or anything like that. But based off of popularity, I would definitely put it at High Rogue. I think people have always been wanting Ice Barrier to be a somewhat, competitive deck, so that kind of finally happening, I think, was something that I think a lot of people will be excited for, and you'll definitely see the deck, at least a local level. So a pure kind of Ice Barrier, I would definitely put at like a High Rogue. It does have a lot of plays, being able to end on like Omni Negates through Toad with a lot of like interruptions, so it is definitely something to look out for. From there, a little bit of a stronger version I would recommend is a Runic build, which obviously does kind of add in a Runic engine, which at this point is a little bit more budget friendly, with the reprints in last year's 10s. And I just think that it takes the deck to a next level. I've definitely tested this one out a little bit, and the Runic cards are obviously really great themselves, and they actually pair pretty nicely with the Ice Barrier. They don't really have too much, issues between each other, so I definitely think it is a pretty nice option to consider. Moving on from there, we have a pure Traptrix version, which, honestly, I think you could classify as either low rogue to kind of casual at this point. I think it depends on, how well versed you are in the deck. It is definitely one of those that, if you're a little bit more familiar with the deck and matchups in the current meta, it could be something as decent as like a low rogue deck to more casual, like I said, just depending on how familiar you are with everything. So kind of for that reason, I'll just put it in casual. The deck really has been power crept to some extent, with obviously like Snake Eyes and, the Fiendsmith and everything else that is coming out. So it has kind of fallen off a little bit, but it is definitely still a very fun kind of entry-level deck that I think a lot of people would enjoy. From there, kind of like a little bit of a step up is adding in the adventure engine. It just gives you a few more things. Obviously you do lose your normal summon with the adventure engine, but getting back a Omni Negate I think is a pretty fair trade, and you have a lot of ways to just kind of do things around that without, that normal summon effect. So I think for that reason, I think I definitely put it as a little bit of a step up on the pure version. And then lastly, we do have the Ragnara version, which I definitely think is the best version in the game today. Obviously, the Ragnara is a pretty nice package for plant-type decks, plant and insect in particular type decks, so it pairs very nicely with Traptrix, and I think it is a pretty good option if you're just kind of getting into the game. From there, we do have a pure pearly version, which I'll definitely put as the highest here on the High Rogue. The deck has gotten more cards back from the ban list, but despite that, the kind of meta has just kind of continued to kind of power creep it without any new cards for pearly. I think really it's just kind of sit at a high rogue. Very nice that, you know, a lot of the key pieces have been reprinted and are very accessible, so definitely think that if you're looking for something that you can do well at locals, this is definitely a really cheap and really fun option to pick up. Now, what is probably the best deck on this list is going to be Flow. It's a fantastic deck. I'm personally not a fan of the gameplay, but it really does kind of give you a lot of options. It's a deck that obviously revolves around access to, you know, additional normal summons, and just kind of disrupting your opponent, you know, through obviously like Impin or you know, kind of like other options that you have available to you. So it is definitely a deck that you can see a lot of success with. It mains Shifter, which is obviously always a problem card, so definitely think it is a pretty good one to consider. It will be the one that's hit the worst with the new Momochi card coming out, obviously, since that one does allow you to draw off of normal summons, which was kind of always this deck's benefit against like Maxi and Master Duel. But yeah, we'll definitely have to see how that Momochi card plays out and whether or not that really affects Flow too much. And then there is Sky Striker, which I think is a very interesting deck. Obviously, it did get some new cards in the Battles of Legend as well, and I definitely think that it can be a pretty successful deck. This is another one of those decks that, you know, it can be a tier 2 deck with the right pilot, but, you know, really if you're just kind of getting into it and really just picking up the deck, it's going to be a kind of high rogue level deck. It is definitely a little bit more of a skill dependent deck, so as you kind of go from there, you know, you can definitely notice that without changing too much, the deck does feel a lot better as you kind of like learn a little bit more of the lines. But for that reason, definitely just kind of goes a little bit more in like a high rogue level. Runic Stun is probably the I'd say probably the second best deck that you can get on a budget right now. Maybe above Flow, really just kind of depends. I think the only reason Flow sees a little bit less play is I think a lot of people agree that it is not the funnest strategy to play, but honestly, neither is, you know, stun decks. But Runic Stun is definitely an option. It's seen a lot of tops, not just locally, but regionally, even to kind of like YCS level events. So it's definitely an option to consider, and it's budget friendly, which just makes it another kind of great option that if you're not looking to spend too much on the game, you still actually can compete at a pretty high level. From there, Sword Soul, my personal all-time favorite deck. I would love if it were in a little bit more of a tier 2, and it actually still is a very good deck, but probably a little bit more in a high rogue. The loss of Baron was unfortunate. It wasn't the end of the world for the deck, but it obviously did hit the ceiling of Sword Soul, so it's not quite where it once was. Because of that, I think maybe a little bit better of an option is a Sword Soul Super Heavy Samurai list, which I will definitely release a profile on next week. This just kind of gives you a little bit more options. It makes going into Dinglong a little bit easier, and just kind of like I said, gives you a little bit more to kind of play around with. So for that reason, I definitely think that it is a kind of tier 2 worthy option. And last but not least, we do have several Sprite variants. Sprite Adventure, which I have recently shown off a deck list for, I think is a pretty decently high rogue deck. Sprite cards just obviously got reprinted. Adventure cards got reprinted in last year's 10, so definitely very accessible and a very fun and competitive strategy to pick up. On that same level is, I think now, Sprite Toad. You can take advantage of the new Ice Barrier card to easily kind of be able to bring out a Totally Awesome, and I think that, you know, obviously those both being Omni-Negates kind of just puts them on a very similar level. Obviously with the Toad package, it's a little bit less cards, so you kind of can fit in a little bit more hand traps, so it really just kind of depends on which you prefer between the two. Sprite Runic is, I don't know, quite tier 2, but it is definitely the, high rogue level. It's a very fun competitive strategy. Obviously, Runic makes just about anything better, and it pairs really nicely with Sprite in that regard. And then lastly, we do have Sprite Pearly, and I think that is just kind of the best of both for each deck. Just putting them together, you're able to end on Sprite Negates, you're able to end on, X Pearly Noir. Really just kind of synergizes really well between the two decks, and I think actually makes a pretty competitive strategy. And yeah, that is kind of the last deck I wanted to show off, but let me know down below what y'all think, if you're playing any of these decks, or if anything I maybe missed that you would consider in any of these options. Definitely always interested to hear that, and I will see y'all next time.